Iain Begg, who's a professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Iain, always good to see you. Is a reset needed?
Whether it's needed or not, it's happening. I think that's more important than whether it's needed. There is a major change going on in relation to things like climate change. There is a huge effort going on globally to introduce net carbon zero by 2050 or sooner in some cases. There is a recognition of global common ground on things like dealing with the pandemic. So yes, I think we can safely say it's already happening. And it's needed in some senses because you can identify the complications of not having this kind of reset.
I mean, the complications may have been obvious for quite some time. I mean, without getting into a philosophical discussion about modalities or whatever you want to call it of governance, we're in a system where, the Fukuyama book, of course, we're in a system where neoliberalism has won, that free markets rule all. Has that system proven that it can't take care of the needs of the majority, but only rewards a minority? In other words, has the coronavirus pandemic brought that to the fore, and therefore there needs to be that kind of reset as well that's going to benefit the majority?
Certainly, that's part of the story that Klaus Schwab and Prince Charles have been putting together, but it's also a trend visible elsewhere. There has been a backlash against the concentration of wealth in both the hands of some individuals and the hands of some countries. There's been a backlash more recently against the fact that the advanced Western economies have been able to inoculate themselves against the coronavirus, leaving huge gaps in the rest of the world. But at the same time, a recognition that the health crisis requires us to work together. So yes, I think the shortcomings of globalization, what you might call globalization Mark III, have been recognized. There's a need now to work on the changes that are being induced by the pandemic, particularly in relation to information sharing, which presage a new wave of globalization, which has at least the possibility to be more fair.
Iain, you may well have seen this article. It was April. It was in the Wall Street Journal. It was written by Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State of the United States, of course. And just to read you a little bit of it, he wrote, "Sustaining the public trust is crucial to social solidarity, to the relation of societies with each other, and to international peace and stability. Nations cohere and flourish on the belief that their institutions can foresee calamity, arrest its impact, and restore stability. When the COVID-19 pandemic is over, many countries' institutions will be perceived as having failed." Do you see any evidence of a change in the relationship between the citizenry and their governments in terms of the trust that people have in the people who are supposed to be in charge of them?
I think there's a mixed picture in this. There's a sense that governments were losing their way in the run-up to the pandemic. You saw this in all the success of populist movements in different parts of the world, not least in the US with the success of Trump. But there's been some restoration of faith in the capacity of the state to do things. What seems to be happening is the state is coming back, and that reinvention of the state, giving it new purposes in dealing with the adverse consequences of globalization, seems to me to be what's happening now. Gordon Brown, for example, the former British Prime Minister, has recently published a book in which he sets out 7 ways to change the world. And I think he hits the nail on the head with some of those things he's referring to. I would pick out 2 in particular. One is a major effort globally is needed on education. And the second is on tax. We heard about the initiatives on tax around the G7 a few weeks ago. But I think there's a concern that somehow tax avoidance and tax evasion simply isn't being dealt with. And that may be the next great move to try to level the playing field.
That was one of the things that the G7 leaders were discussing at their recent summit in Cornwall in the south of England, of course. The other thing that Boris Johnson announced there was a commitment by the G7 to deliver 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines to the developing world. There was a leading article in, I think, the previous edition of The Economist, which said that it would probably cost about $50 billion for G7 countries, richer nations, to put together a package which would deliver vaccines to keep the developing world safe from COVID-19, and the financial return for that investment would be in the trillions. And The Economist says that the G7 failed to grasp an opportunity which they simply couldn't afford to do. Do you think the G7 is failing in terms of the coronavirus pandemic and equality around the world?
It's not doing enough. And it was quite plain at the summit in Cornwall that while there was a recognition of the need to vaccinate the world, 1 billion doses isn't going to do it. To vaccinate the world, you need 8 times that at least, given that you need 2 vaccinations for all adults. So a much bigger effort is needed. But the economists are undoubtedly correct that the payoff from this is enormous. Stabilize the world, both in terms of economy and in relation to health, and you're going to get a payoff. This goes back to another famous Scotsman, not just Gordon Brown, another resident of Fife where he lives, and that is Adam Smith. The common good needs to be recognised.
Iain, it's always a pleasure to hear your analyses. Thank you so much indeed. Iain Begg from the LSE.